"You're coming with me," said the lonely rancher to the woman beaten for giving birth to triplet girls, and no one in the dusty town dared to stop him. Texas Territory, May 1884. The wind carried dust and secrets across the empty plains as the dying sun bled over the horizon. In the lonely town of Red Hollow, people spoke in low voices, afraid their words might reach the wrong ears. They said a woman had been beaten and left for dead, not because she stole, not because she sinned, but because she gave birth to 3 baby girls. The church bell hadn't rung in months, yet that night it echoed in her cries as she tried to shield her newborns from the cold ground. Blood mixed with dust, and every breath she took felt heavier than the last. Her name was Clara May, and though her body was broken, her spirit refused to die. Out beyond the town's edge, a horse's hooves thundered through the dusk. A lonely rancher named Elias Carter riding toward the sound of sorrow, unaware his life was about to change forever. Clara May could barely feel her legs as she crawled toward the weak light flickering through the church ruins, her breath trembling in the thick silence of Red Hollow's night. The sound of the horse grew closer, but she didn't have the strength to lift her head. The pain in her ribs burned like fire, yet she clutched her babies tighter, whispering their names, Ella, June, and Rose, as if saying them aloud could keep them alive. She had lost count of the hours since she'd been thrown out of her own home. The man she once called husband spitting curses at her for bringing 3 daughters into a world that worshipped sons. Her skin was cold, her dress torn, and every heartbeat felt like a struggle against death. The town had watched, no one had helped, and the dust-covered road behind her still carried her blood. Every breath was heavy, but she wouldn't let go of her girls. She thought of the old stories her mother once told her about angels walking disguised as men, saving those who had nothing left to lose. She didn't believe them then, but now, as thunder rolled in the distance, she prayed one might find her before morning. She pressed her lips to each baby's forehead, tasting the salt of her own tears, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Then she heard the horse stop. The silence that followed was so deep it made her heart race. She wanted to hide, but her body refused to move. The footsteps came slow, steady and sure. A man's voice broke the quiet, deep and low, the kind that carried both command and sorrow. "Ma'am," he said, his shadow falling over her like shelter from the cruel night. She didn't answer, only turned her face away, afraid he might be another who'd judge her. But his voice softened. "Don't be scared." He knelt beside her, saw the bruises, the babies, the strength still burning faintly in her eyes. "What happened to you?" he asked, though the truth was already written across her torn skin. She tried to speak, but the words dissolved into the cold wind. He took off his coat, wrapped it around her and the infants, his hands trembling just enough to show his heart wasn't made of stone. "You'll freeze out here," he murmured, more to himself than to her. She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw the loneliness carved into his face like scars that never healed. He lifted his gaze to the stars before saying quietly, almost as if making a promise to the heavens, "You're coming with me." For a long moment she didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't believe him, but something in his tone, firm yet kind, broke the wall of fear that had trapped her. She let her head fall against his arm, exhausted as he lifted her from the ground and carried her toward his horse. The wind howled across the plains, but for the first time that night, Clara May felt the faintest flicker of safety, not knowing that the road ahead would test both their hearts in ways neither could imagine. Elias Carter rode through the cold night with Clara May cradled against his chest, the 3 infants wrapped inside his coat, their faint cries lost beneath the steady rhythm of hooves striking hard ground. The moon hung low, silvering the vast emptiness that stretched for miles, and in that silence his thoughts drifted where he had buried them years ago. He had once known love, warmth, laughter that filled these same plains, but death had taken it all without mercy. His wife, Mary, and their little boy had been gone for almost a decade, leaving behind only the echo of promises he could never keep. The ranch had turned into a ghost of its own, a place where he spoke to the wind because there was no one else to hear him. Yet tonight, as he felt the fragile weight of Clara and her children, something long dead inside him began to stir. When he reached his land, the old barn stood crooked against the horizon, its wooden beams creaking with every gust of wind. He dismounted carefully, carrying Clara inside the small cabin that still smelled faintly of old hay and forgotten prayers. He laid her on the cot by the fire, fed the flames with trembling hands, and watched the orange light chase away the shadows that had claimed his home for too long. Her face was pale, her pulse weak, but there was defiance even in her stillness. He could see it, the same fight that had once burned in Mary's eyes when life tried to break her. He poured a little water into a tin cup, pressing it to Clara's lips, whispering, "Easy now. You're safe here." She didn't respond, but her fingers moved slightly, as if reaching for trust. Elias sat back, his chest tight, unsure why this stranger's pain cut so deep. He told himself he was only doing what was right, that any decent man would have done the same, but he knew better. He wasn't saving her out of duty. He was trying to save himself from the silence that had eaten away his soul. He glanced at the babies, asleep beside her, their breaths soft as falling feathers. Each tiny rise and fall of their chests felt like a heartbeat returning to the house, like a forgotten melody finding its rhythm again. The night outside grew colder, and the wind began to whistle through the cracks in the walls. Elias stood, fixed them one by one, his hands rough yet careful, his mind fighting against memories that threatened to drown him. He hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, yet now he found himself talking softly to the sleeping mother and her girls, as if afraid that if he stopped, the moment would vanish. He told them about the horses, about the hills turning gold at sunrise, about the sound of rain when it finally came after months of drought. His voice broke once when he mentioned his wife, but Clara stirred, opening her eyes just enough to see him staring into the fire like a man haunted by ghosts. She wanted to speak but couldn't, and he didn't ask anything more. Their silence said enough. Two lost hearts, breathing under the same roof, both too broken to know they were saving each other already. Morning crept over the plains with a pale, uncertain light, and the cabin seemed to breathe again after years of silence. Elias Carter stepped outside, the air cool against his face, the horizon stretching wide and endless like a memory that refused to fade. He had barely slept. His thoughts kept circling back to the fragile woman lying inside, and the three tiny souls depending on her strength. He saddled his horse, not to leave, but to clear his head, riding out toward the old church ruins at the edge of his land where the earth still held the ashes of what once was. He hadn't gone there since the fire that took Mary and the child, but something about Clara's presence had stirred ghosts that refused to stay buried. As he rode through the whispering grass, he saw movement near the broken stone archway. Clara was sitting there, wrapped in his coat, holding her babies close and humming something soft. Her voice cracked yet tender, the kind of sound that carried both pain and hope. He slowed his horse, watching her for a moment before speaking, his tone quiet but steady. "You shouldn't be out here." She flinched at his voice, clutching her children tighter, eyes wide with fear. He dismounted slowly, careful not to frighten her, his boots crunching on dry soil as he removed his hat and looked straight at her. She didn't run, though every muscle in her body told her to. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, she seemed smaller than the morning shadows. "I didn't mean to leave," she whispered, her words trembling like the breeze. "I just wanted to see the sky." He nodded, his expression unreadable but his gaze filled with something deep and human. He crouched beside her, resting one hand on his knee, the other brushing the dust from a fallen cross half buried in the ground. "You're coming with me," he said, not as a command but as a promise. Clara's throat tightened, tears welling up again as she stared into his eyes. They weren't cold or filled with pity. They were lonely, carved by loss, the kind of loneliness that recognized its reflection in her own. She wanted to argue, to tell him she wasn't his responsibility, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she looked at the baby sleeping against her chest and felt the pull of something she hadn't known in years. Safety. Elias reached out his hand, not to grab but to offer. She hesitated, the silence stretching thin between them until the wind filled it with the sound of the grass swaying like waves. She finally placed her hand in his, small, shaking but alive. He helped her stand, steadying her when her knees faltered, and for a brief second, she met his gaze again. The sun caught the edges of his face, softening the lines of sorrow that time had carved there. "We'll go slow," he murmured. Guiding her toward the horse, she nodded, unable to speak. The words caught behind her tears. As he lifted her into the saddle, the baby stirred, one letting out a soft cry. He mounted behind her, holding the reins gently, his voice low as he said, "You're safe now." The world around them seemed to pause, and as the horse began to move, the broken church faded behind them like a bad dream. Neither of them wanted to remember again. The horse moved steady through the long stretch of prairie, its hooves striking rhythm beneath the soft cries of the triplets and the whisper of wind that carried the scent of rain far away. Elias kept his eyes fixed ahead, the horizon glowing faintly gold, while Clara leaned against him, too weak to speak yet no longer afraid. The plains stretched endless, empty but alive, as if watching two lost souls trying to find a reason to keep moving. When they reached the ranch, the air was heavy with dust and silence, broken only by the sound of the wooden gate creaking open. He lifted her gently from the saddle, carried her inside, and placed her on the bed he had made by the fire. The babies were laid beside her, their small breaths a quiet miracle in a place that had forgotten warmth. He cooked what little food he had, the smell of beans and bread filling the room, and handed her a bowl without a word. She ate slowly, eyes lowered, unsure how to thank a man who didn't ask for thanks. The nights passed heavy and still, but each morning he found a way to fix something, the roof, the fence, the well, as if repairing the world one broken piece at a time. Clara began to move around, helping with chores, her steps uncertain yet stronger each day. She washed the clothes, tended the fire, and sometimes stood by the window watching the plains as the sun sank low and turned everything to fire. Her silence no longer felt empty. It felt like peace returning after a long storm. The triplets grew stronger, their laughter soft and sweet, filling corners of the house that had known only echoes for years. Elias would stop working sometimes just to listen, his hands still in the dirt, his chest tightening with something he couldn't name. He had forgotten what life sounded like until those tiny voices reminded him. Clara often caught him staring at the girls with a quiet smile, the kind that carried more kindness than words ever could. She didn't know what he saw in her, or why he had chosen to help, but she began to trust the rhythm of their quiet days. He never crossed her space, never demanded anything, only made sure she and her daughters had what they needed. One evening, when the wind rose strong and clouds gathered over the plains, she found him standing outside, staring into the distance where the storm brewed. She stepped beside him, her shawl wrapped tight, and for the first time she spoke without fear. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has," she said softly. He looked at her, rain beginning to fall, his voice low but certain. "You deserved better than what this world gave you." The storm broke, drenching them both, but neither moved. They stood there beneath the dark sky, two souls washed clean by rain and silence, the land around them breathing again, as if forgiving them for every pain they had carried. The road to redemption had already begun, not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of surviving together beneath the endless Texas sky. Seasons changed over Red Hollow, and the once empty ranch now echoed with laughter that carried farther than the wind. Clara walked with strength in her steps, her daughters chasing sunlight through the fields, their giggles rising like music against the wide sky. Elias watched them from the porch, his hands rough, his heart quiet for the first time in years. The town that had turned its back now tipped their hats as she passed, unable to deny the courage that refused to die in her eyes. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes, and he had learned that love didn't always come with words. Sometimes it lived in the silence between two hearts, as the sun melted behind the hills, painting the world in gold and memory. Elias looked toward Clara and whispered to himself that redemption had a face, and it smiled back at him. He hadn't just found peace, he had finally found home.